Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. My name is Phil Sharp. I'm director of the Institute of Politics and very delighted tonight to be presenting a lean conservative thinker and writer on America's role in today's world. Tonight's event is co-sponsored by the Harvard Republican Club, by the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, by the Harvard Southeast Asian Society, and by the Kennedy School Republican Caucus. But the honor for introducing our speaker tonight goes to Harvard undergraduate Jeff Clemens. Jeff is a senior studying economics. He's from Spokane, Washington, and he's vice president of the Harvard Republican Club. Ladies and gentlemen, Jeff Clemens.
Thank you very much, Director Sharp. Dsouza was born in India in 1961. He first set foot in the United States at the age of 17 to attend an American high school while using a Rotary Club scholarship. The next year, he enrolled at Dartmouth College. It is Dsouza's time at Dartmouth that perhaps most endears him to his followers among today's college Republicans. While there, he joined forces with a group of rabble-rousing conservatives on the staff of the Dartmouth Review, a publication named in honor of William F. Buckley's National Review magazine. In his book, Letters to a Young Conservative, Dsouza describes the temperament of his fellow Dartmouth conservatives as being somewhat radical. They sought to shift the campus's center of political gravity by satirizing and provoking those entrenched in the conventional wisdom of the left. One of the Dartmouth Review's favorite targets was music department professor William Cole, a professor whose classroom antics included calling white students honkies and who once praised an attempt to blow up the Washington Monument as an enlightened attack on a racist society. The Dartmouth Review responded by publishing an article that mocked Professor Cole by using his own inflammatory words against him, as they had been recorded in class. When the faculty responded with a formal denunciation of the Dartmouth Review, Dsouza and friends took it as an indication that they had been successful. In response, they promptly passed a resolution of their own denouncing the Dartmouth faculty. Since graduating from Dartmouth Phi Beta Kappa in 1983, Mr. Dsouza has led a distinguished career. In the mid-1980s, he edited two magazines, Crisis and Policy Review. While still in his 20s, he served in the Reagan White House as a senior domestic policy advisor in 1987 and 1988. During his time at the White House, he advised the president on educational standards, affirmative action, civil rights, and constitutional matters. His views on many of these subjects can most easily be expressed as placing a primary emphasis on personal freedom and individual accountability. During the 1990s, Mr. Dsouza turned to writing books. He is most famous, perhaps, for Illiberal Education, The Politics of Race and Sex on College Campuses, which was the first book-length expose of political correctness at America's college campuses. Also well known is his more recent book, What's So Great About America, which makes a case for American exceptionalism in the world. For Mr. Dsouza, life in the United States is truly a choice. He came here by choice, he remained here by choice, and he ultimately took his oath of U.S. citizenship by choice. In this sense, he has a unique perspective from which to give the talk he has prepared for today. It is entitled, In Defense of American Empire. Without further ado, I am proud to introduce to you Mr. Dinesh Dsouza.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I realize I'm coming suspiciously close to the election outcome, and I realize that some of the Harvard students are still on grief counseling, but nevertheless, I'm very happy to be here. I appreciate Jeff recalling my days as a right-wing rebel at Dartmouth College. We used to tell the deans that taking on our undergraduate newspaper was like wrestling with a pig. Not only did it get everyone dirty, but the pig liked it. I've been told to keep my remarks fairly brief so we have plenty of time for questions, and so in my opening remarks, I will try to adopt the motto that King Henry VIII used with one of his wives. He said, "I won't keep you long." We were in a very interesting new political season but also, more importantly, a very interesting moment in history in which many people are wondering if Islamic fundamentalism or Islamic radicalism may be replacing Soviet communism as the great challenge or the great threat facing the United States. I think at first glance, if you try to compare the old Soviet Union with the Islamic world, it's a very inappropriate comparison. The Soviets had a massive arsenal of nuclear weapons. But I think we observe almost daily that the Islamic world has something that the Soviet Union, particularly toward the end, did not have. And that is, of course, true believers. By the time the Berlin Wall fell, if you wanted to find a true believing Marxist, you would have to go to the Department of Romance Languages here at Harvard, probably. There weren't so many left in the Soviet bloc. And to me, the real epitome, one may say, of the true believer in the Muslim world is, of course, the suicide bomber. But like so many terms that define our foreign policy understanding and our foreign policy debate, many of these terms that we use, the suicide bomber, the war against terrorism, and so on, are misnomers of a sort. For example, we're not fighting, are we, a war against terrorism any more than in World War II we were fighting a war against kamikazeism. No, we were fighting the armies of Imperial Japan. Similarly, today the United States is fighting a war against a certain species of Islamic radicalism. Terrorism is merely the weapon of choice employed by this lethal enemy. And similarly, as I mentioned a moment ago, the suicide bomber, if one thinks about it, is not suicidal at all. Traditionally, a suicide is somebody who doesn't want to live. My life is worthless, I'm happy to chuck it in. The suicide bomber wants to live, but is willing to die for something that he or she deems to be higher. In the case of the 9/11 bombers, one may say not that they love their life less, but they hated America more. One of the questions I try to explore in my book on America is, what is it about America that makes it simultaneously the most loved and, one may say, the most hated nation on the planet? But today I want to focus in a little bit more on the debate about Iraq. And precisely because here is a case of U.S. intervention, continuing U.S. involvement in an expedition whose original rationale appears to have collapsed. And so my question is, given the apparent absence of weapons of mass destruction, why did we go into Iraq? Did Bush lie about it? What was the point of going in the first place? What's the rationale for staying when the apparent original justification was or proved to be invalid? Now, first of all, I think when one looks at American foreign policy and when one tries to judge an American action, one should make a distinction between what one may call the role of the pundit or the analyst or the scholar on the one hand, and the role of the statesman on the other. This is something I learned a little bit in my brief tenure in the Reagan administration, namely that the statesman is in the moving current of events. The statesman has to make decisions based upon the information available at the time. The pundit is in a different position. The pundit has the luxury of hindsight. The pundit can say, knowing what we know now, why did you do what you did then? To which the statesman's obvious answer is, because I didn't know what we know now. I didn't have the luxury of retroactive judgment. I had to make a decision at the time. Now, in looking back at the original justification for Iraq, the Bush administration had to weigh two competing possibilities and look at the possibility of being wrong in either case. For example, if you invade Iraq and there are no weapons of mass destruction, what's the downside? Well, the downside is that you have expended resources, you have risked lives, you have invaded a foreign country, you have created at least temporary instability, you might have provoked a resistance, and of course you have liberated Iraq. That's the downside. But what if you don't act and are wrong? What if Iraq has or is able to shortly acquire and perhaps to deploy or to sell or to use weapons of mass destruction? What if an American city goes up in smoke? Who's going to take the blame then? What about the risk of inaction? Here's what I'm getting at. What I'm getting at is in trying to evaluate Iraq, we have to put ourselves in the place of a decision maker who doesn't know what will be found out later, who is looking at a world shaped after 9/11 and is also faced with an alarming new possibility, which is to say that there is now the knowledge to build, and there is the intelligence that suggests that Iraq is building or is pursuing weapons which make the old theories of deterrence and preemption and so on somewhat invalid. Because the old theory of deterrence was that you don't attack first. You wait till the other guy attacks. You take the punch in the belly, and then you strike back. But of course, when you're dealing with weapons of cataclysmic impact, a weapon that can kill not 50 or 100 or 1,000 or even 3,000 people, when you're faced with the knowledge that the greatest terrorist threat faced by America is not Al-Qaeda, and it's kind of foolish to keep saying there's no connection between Iraq and the guys who did 9/11. The guys who did 9/11 are dead. And the Bush administration was faced with the dismaying knowledge that the Al-Qaeda terrorists flying planes into buildings can kill 500 or 1,000 or 3,000 people, but they can't kill 100,000 or 500,000 or 1,000,000, so that the greatest terrorist threat we face is nuclear-tipped terrorism or biological terrorism or chemical weapons deployed on a mass scale. And as I suggested a moment ago, though, the knowledge of how to make these weapons and the knowledge of how to use them overturns or calls into question many traditional notions of war and just war and when one should attack and so on. Traditionally, for example, the idea was that if somebody threatened to attack you, you could deter them with the certain knowledge that you could do equal or greater destruction in retaliation. And this, of course, kept the Soviet Union in a somewhat unstable but nevertheless very real abeyance for 50 years. Don't think that you can destroy New York and Chicago. We'll take out Moscow and Kiev. But of course, this kind of reasoning, which is valid in the case of the Soviet Union, may not be valid if you're dealing with someone like bin Laden. You can't say to him, listen, don't think of blowing up New York City. We'll take out Riyadh. Because his answer may very well be, well, when do we start? So the Bush administration was faced with the belief that this is a new situation that justifies America taking preemptive action because the risks of being wrong are too great. So the United States invades Iraq and does not find weapons of mass destruction, raising the question of what is the rationale for staying in Iraq? What's the point of being there? What are we trying to achieve over there? And in getting to this question, it seems to me we have to distinguish between the original rationale for a war and a rationale for a continuing war that might be somewhat different. As a case in point, let me give the example of the Civil War, in which after fighting the campaign for 1860, the election of 1860, on the issue of slavery, Abraham Lincoln, upon being elected, began to deny that the Civil War was about slavery at all. In fact, in his letter to Horace Greeley, written almost a year after the South began to secede, Lincoln said, if I could save the Union without freeing a single slave, I would do it. And of course, again, applying, one may say, the fallacy of retroactive judgment, a lot of pundits today will look at that and say, oh, look, see, this proves that Abraham Lincoln didn't really care about slavery. But the truth of it is that if you looked at the statesman, Lincoln, in the moving current of events and asked, why did he say this? Why did he change the rationale for the war? You would realize that once the Civil War erupted, there were a half dozen border states, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and so on, all of which had slaves but had not joined the Confederacy. And Lincoln's fear, very substantiated as it turns out, was that, look, if these states join the Confederacy, then the cause of the Union is much more difficult, if not impossible. And so in the middle of the war, Lincoln redefines the war with the statesman-like objective of keeping the slave-owning border states in the Union, preventing them from defecting to the Confederacy, as indeed they never did. So applying this kind of reasoning or analogy, one may say, to Iraq, what is the United States trying to achieve there? Now, let me say that if one looks at the Middle East today, one sees one obvious presence and one obvious absence. What is the obvious presence? The obvious presence is there is, in the case of Iran, a viable, existing, 25-year-old Islamic theocracy established by Khomeini around 1980. And Khomeini, we should remember, is the match that has lit the conflagration that has now swept the Islamic world. Khomeini proves for Islamic radicals the viability of Islamic theocracy in the modern era. Everywhere else, the bin Ladens of the world are in opposition. But in Iran, one may say, the Islamic radicals are in control of a major state. And in fact, this is an important point because lots of people today say, well, isn't it ironic that we're trying to get rid of Saddam Hussein? We used to support Saddam Hussein. Well, yes, but this was during the Iran-Iraq war when Saddam Hussein was fighting Khomeini. And politics, to a large degree, is defined by the ethic of the lesser evil. You often ally with the bad guy to get rid of the worse guy. And the judgment in 1980, which can be debated, but which is not absurd, was that Hussein, being relatively secular, was a lesser evil compared then to Khomeini. Be that as it may, my point is that Khomeini, in a way, is an Islamic Khomeiniism, and the mullahs ruling Iran prove that the Islamic radicals are in control of a major state. By contrast, I ask you, how many democracies are there in the Arab world? Answer, 0. There is Muslim democracy outside the Arab world, in Turkey, in Indonesia, perhaps one could say in India. But nevertheless, those Islamic democracies, one may say, are besieged. And certainly in the Arab world, the number of self-governing societies amounts to precisely 0. So on the one hand, you have the viability of Islamic theocracy, and on the other hand, you have the absence, glaring absence, one may say, of Islamic democracy in the Arab world. So this brings me to what seems to me to be a very legitimate objective for American foreign policy, to see if the alien seed of democracy can be planted and take root in a part of the world that has never known it. Because the idea is that if you can have democracy in Iraq, if 3 years from now Iraq is a standing democracy, and if the idea of democracy spreads beyond to Egypt or Iran or Syria or Saudi Arabia, you can see the beginnings of an historical transformation no less stunning than the transformation of the old Soviet Union. Now, is that worth a good deal of American effort and resolve and patience and resources? I think yes. Now, I realize that this expedition, this enterprise, is in a way supremely difficult. There are some people who think it's impossible at the outset, and so you hear it said, well, how can we establish democracy in Iraq? You can't establish democracy at the point of a bayonet, until we recall that after World War II, the United States could and did establish democracy at the point of a bayonet in Japan and in Germany, and the results have been excellent. Even on the right, there are reservations about American empire, about Iraq, and these reservations focus on the apparent inconsistency of using force, as we did in Iraq, to try to establish liberty. It seems somehow contradictory to use coercion to try to get freedom. But again, this is one may say, the contradiction of the theoretical man. As a practical matter, what history shows us is that nations very rarely achieve liberty except by force, and often external force. The United States is a free country. How did we get liberty in the United States? We had a revolution. The opponents of the revolution were banished or killed. How did African Americans win their freedom in America? It took a civil war. It took the invasion of, one may say, an external force, the northern armies, to bring to the southern slaves a freedom that they were not in a position, that they were not strong enough to achieve for themselves. And the reason that force is frequently required to establish liberty is for the very simple reason that tyrants rarely relinquish power voluntarily. And so you might say, well, that's all reasonably good. We are trying to do a good thing in Iraq, but why do we have to do it? This was the thrust, and one may say, of the Kerry argument against Bush. Why don't we have other people do it? What about our friends? What about the United Nations? Isn't collective action better than unilateral action? And the answer is not necessarily. The unilateral action has its limits, but so does collective action. A lot of people say today, we fought the first Gulf War in 1991. Why didn't we go all the way to Baghdad? Why didn't we get rid of Saddam Hussein then? We would have saved a lot of life, a lot of expense. We should have done it a long time ago. Yes, we should have done it a long time ago, but guess why we didn't do it? We had a coalition assembled by George Bush the father, the European countries, the Islamic countries. Everyone established their lowest common denominator, push Hussein out of Kuwait and then stop. And so America's hands were tied. Once Hussein was pushed out of Kuwait, the United States could not go any further at the risk of jeopardizing its own coalition. So unilateral action has limits, but so does collective action. And then what about the United Nations? Why not have the United Nations help in this case? Well, first of all, it's kind of helpful to realize that of the 200 or so countries that make up the United Nations, only about a half of them, about 100 countries, are democratic. The other 50% of countries in the United Nations is made up of tyrannies, despots, various forms of unelected regimes of one sort or the other. So how can the United Nations be trusted to impose democracy in Iraq when it can't impose democracy on the United Nations? And the principles of the United Nations, the most notable of them being the principle of international law, these principles have proved very friendly to the worst despots of the world. Here's what I mean. International law sounds like a very good thing. Its principle, its governing norm is sovereignty. Sovereignty means that the borders of a country are legally inviolable. You should not trespass across the boundaries of a country and violate its sovereignty. And then if you look at a guy like Saddam Hussein and you ask yourself this question, how did he come to power? Through the barrel of a gun. How did he rule for so many years? By force. What right does a guy like Hussein have to rule Iraq? None. So what moral objection is there to a third party stepping across the border and pushing him out? None. And you might say, well, wait a minute, Dinesh, are you implying that the United States has the moral right to eject and decapitate and defenestrate and get rid of all the despots and dictators and tyrants of the world? Yes. Of course we do. Now, whether or not we do it, how we do it, when we do it, what are the conditions on which America intervenes, this is governed entirely by prudence. What I mean by this is that foreign policy is not philanthropy. We are not the world's policemen. We are not on a mission from God or anyone else. Our job in the world is to protect America's interests. But sometimes the best way to protect America's interests is to export America's ideals. Ultimately, terrorism arises, does it not, out of the dysfunctional regimes in the Middle East. ultimately, is it not the case that a self-governing society is less of a risk to us than a tyrannical society? When is the last time in history that one democratic country has attacked another? I can't think of a single example. So democracy is not just some woolly-headed neoconservative nostrum, or if it is, that's not why I support it. We're supporting democracy for two reasons. It strengthens our security while making them better off. Because during the election campaign, we heard so many proclamations. The Iraqi people think this. The Iraqi people are against us. The Iraqi people don't like. And my question is, how on earth does anyone know? Who's consulted the Iraqi people? Yes, we have a resistance numbering between 25 and 30,000 people in a nation of millions. You only know what the Iraqi people think when you have a free election. That's the way to find out what the Iraqi people really believe. And the test of American foreign policy is simply this. In advancing our self-interest, do we make the world a better place or a worse place? This is something that other countries can legitimately ask. And I think if we apply it to American foreign policy over the last 5 or 10 or 30 or 50 years, in almost every case, I think one can show that American foreign policy, although motivated in part by self-interest, has also left the world a lot better. I'm not just talking about World War II, where America got into it for self-interest, but left the world freer and better, or the Cold War. But even more recently, why did we fight the first Gulf War? I am sure in part to protect American access to oil. But in protecting American access to oil, did the United States not also liberate Kuwait? It did. Or consider Afghanistan. The United States got involved for reasons of self-interest, 9/11, but isn't Afghanistan better off than it was under the Taliban? Now, the test of foreign policy, incidentally, is not perfection. The test of American foreign policy is making the world better. The goal of the statesman is not to achieve the Garden of Eden, but to do as much good as the circumstances permit. Somebody said in Afghanistan, we have taken a country from the 9th century and left it in the 13th century. Well, maybe so, but that's progress. Or consider Iraq. Is it not a fact that despite the debate over why we went in, that the Iraqis are today and will be vastly better off than they were under Hussein? Anyone who maintains the contrary is in the rather awkward position of saying that even today, Iraq would be better if Saddam Hussein was still running the place. And I remind you that we have him. I take it that he's willing. But the fact that no one has even hinted at bringing the guy back tells me that there's an unspoken understanding that the Iraqis are better off. The Iraqis are better off. So here we are facing this issue of American empire. And I think in some senses, if someone were to ask me, is America an empire? I would answer, as Jefferson did, yes, but an empire of ideals, an empire of liberty was Jefferson's term for it. So in that sense, different than traditional empires. And accountable, one may say, to a much higher standard. American empire is not motivated by the desire to rule the rest of the world. All America wants is peaceful, self-governing societies that America can trade with. That is our goal for this liberal world that we live in. A long time ago, Edmund Burke said, to love our country should be lovely. And in this sense, what Burke is saying is that the highest form of patriotism is based on loving your country, not just because it is yours, but also because it is good. And this, it seems to me, is the interesting question facing us today as students of politics, as citizens, which is to say, does America, and not just what America is, but what America does American foreign policy, does American society meet this Burkean test? And I think at the end of the day, for all its flaws, and one can enumerate many of those, flaws in what America does, flaws in our culture, our society, our popular culture, and so on, but nevertheless, at the end of the day, I think it remains true that America, in a sense, meets this Burkean test and is worthy of our affection and our allegiance, not just because it protects our security, which it does, but I think more importantly because consistently it has stood up for larger humanitarian ideals, global principles, if you will, that have left this world of ours a lot better than we found it. If America did not exist, the world would be a much worse place. So we should be thankful for what America has done. And in a sense, one may say in Iraq as in other countries that if this be the workings of American empire, let us have more of it. Thank you very much.
We're now ready for questions. We have a microphone on each side on the floor and on the loges here. And as those who attend know, the best questions are short statements that end with a question mark. We have only one speaker at a time in our forum. So let's start right here. And please just briefly introduce yourself, and if you're associated with the university, indicate how.
Hi, my name is Paloma. I'm a junior at the college. You spoke briefly about international law and the notion of sovereignty. How does the UN play into notions of sovereignty, and should the US still be involved?
The question is about the United Nations and if its principles are so flawed, what are we doing in it? I think the United Nations has traditionally served some useful purposes. I mean, I think one of its purposes has been to expose people from Rwanda and Haiti and Islamabad and so on to the benefits of fine New York restaurants. And that's perhaps a useful multicultural service. But somewhat more seriously, with regard to Iraq, let me say this. I think the United Nations actually has a role in Iraq, but it's very different than the role that we traditionally hear about. The United Nations' role of Iraq is simply this: to provide, one may say, rainbow cover for the workings of American foreign policy. Let me put that somewhat differently. It's always humiliating for a country to be invaded by another country. Even if the other country has good intentions, even if it's not after your oil, even if it's trying to make a transition to Iraqi sovereignty, even if it's trying to put you on the road to self-reliance, it is a matter of pride, particularly for an ancient civilization. It's very irritating. It's like mom telling you what to do. By and large, you'd rather do it yourself. Remember, in the 80s, we had the Reagan Doctrine. The Reagan Doctrine was based on the idea, no, America shouldn't have to go in and fight for other people's freedom. Let them fight for their own freedom. We'll help them. We'll help the Afghan Mujahideen. We'll help the Nicaraguan rebels. But it's more dignified for people to fight for themselves. But when people are not in a position to fight for themselves, as in the case of the slaves of the antebellum South, as in the case of Iraq, when there is no viable opposition to help, when external force is needed, it is nevertheless humiliating. And since it is humiliating, it is on the other side of the picture consoling to have a lot of international-looking people like Koizumi and Mandela and Kofi Annan and you and me showing up in Iraq so the Iraqis can say, oh, it's not the Americans, it's the international community that's helping us out. So what I'm saying is the United Nations has a symbolic role, not to make any important decisions, which it's incapable of doing, but to provide a kind of psychological consolation for the Iraqis in a necessarily difficult and somewhat embarrassing transition to a free society.
Hi, my name is Annie Lord. I'm a master's student here at the Kennedy School. And you suggested that the decision to go to Iraq took place at a time after September 11th, when in fact many people argue that this decision in fact took place before September 11th. And I was wondering if you could comment to what extent you think that that argument holds merit, and how this would affect your assessment of what we're doing in Iraq, why we went, and what does this mean for our country's morality?
Yes, this comes back to my original point about the statesman and the pundit, because one of the things you have to realize is that whenever decisions are being made, effective policy planning in the National Security Council and the State Department, no less, by the way, than in the Domestic Policy Council, is driven by contingency scenarios. What if Russia were to deploy one of its, or to launch one of its intercontinental ballistic missiles even by accident? What if Pakistan were to go to war and it would go nuclear with India? What should the United States do then? My point is policy planning takes into account all these contingencies. Now, part of the fallacy or perhaps the foolishness of American political rhetoric is if Pakistan were to go to war with India, the obscure diplomat who wrote the memo analyzing that possibility will be heralded as a modern-day Moses because he predicted it. No, he didn't predict it. He was one of 10,000 people writing memos. It simply happens that the contingencies of world events happen to corroborate his memo. Similarly, with regard to Iraq, yes, of course the United States is planning to do this and planning to do that and fighting these war games and anticipating those actions and so on. But no, I think if you look at the decision to go to war in Iraq, and this is a little bit of the difficulty of foreign policy and of American electoral politics, I think that one reason was that after 9/11, a kind of sudden fear of cataclysm, and cataclysm multiplied. But there's a second factor that for reasons of time I didn't go into, and that's this. I think there was a realization that in American foreign policy after 9/11, it was not enough to chase guys who are climbing the monkey bars in Kabul or in Afghanistan, that it was very important for the United States to go into the Middle East. I remember when I was a young boy in India, I'd watch these Wild West movies in which the sheriff, John Wayne, would go into a bar. He's the new sheriff in town, and as he goes in the bar, all the bad guys are drinking and laughing and so on. And what does he do? He doesn't know who's robbed the bank. He doesn't know who's going to... He grabs a couple of the really bad characters, slams their heads together, and walks out to send a message that there's a new sheriff in town. Which is to say that one possible rationale, I was not for the United States' action in Iraq, is simply the need to go into the middle of the Middle East, grab a really bad guy, and repeatedly slam his head against the ground. This is a post-9/11 strategy, necessarily. But it's one of those rationales for war that no politician, no candidate will ever speak about, and as a result, American foreign policy operates at least in partial darkness.
Hi there. My name's Adam Cooper. I'm an intern at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy here at the Kennedy School. Mr. Dsouza, you suggest Iraq is or will be better off for American intervention. Even if this is true, which many would dispute, do you think the cost of 100,000 Iraqi lives is a fair price to pay for this? Are you or the US qualified to make this kind of judgment?
The cost in lives, now, the British journal, The Lancet, I believe, recently published the figure of 100,000. Incidentally, this is a medical journal, and they didn't go to Iraq, and they didn't count any casualties or count any bodies. They did a kind of sample. They did a sample of one area of Iraq, and they extrapolated from the sample. I don't want to debate their methodology. Clearly, people were killed in Iraq, and a fair number of them, certainly 1,000 Americans, and the number of Iraqis varies from 20,000 to, I had heard 40,000. This is the first time I've heard 100,000. But nevertheless, here's what we've got to look at. Number one, let's compare that to the 300,000 and up bodies that have emerged in the mass graves run by Hussein. In other words, people were being killed in Iraq before, lots of them. And a key difference is that those people were being killed by design, and the people who were being killed were innocent. In the case of America, the United States is fighting a war against an insurgency. The people it kills by design, by and large, are the bad guys. Now, sometimes in trying to kill a bad guy, you kill some innocent people too. Collateral damage is a bitter and regrettable but not intended consequence of war. So there is a bit of a moral distinction between the people who have been killed in the American occupation, I think, and the people killed by Hussein. Look, ultimately in all these situations you are facing contingencies that are not easy to anticipate. People say the Bush administration didn't plan very well for the aftermath of the war. Maybe that's true. Maybe that's true. But part of the reason why America didn't plan very well is we go around saying for years things like Saddam Hussein was a dictator who ruled Iraq with an iron hand. Not true. No man, no matter how bloodthirsty, can rule a whole country with an iron hand. One man can at best rule 5 other men, 4 women, and 6 children. How do you rule a whole country? You have a network of collaborators, a mafia-like structure extending throughout the society of tens of thousands of people who help you. These are the people who benefit from your regime, lose power when America comes in, and these are the people, to a large degree, who are fighting us. So these are the collaborators of the Hussein regime, numbering in the thousands. So what I'm saying is, in a sense, to the degree that these are enemy combatants, one makes a distinction between enemy combatants killed and the number of innocent people killed. Not only, by the way, does America make extraordinary efforts to minimize civilian casualties, but in my view, America increases its own casualties to do so. In the siege of Baghdad, for example, the United States was so supremely careful to minimize casualties. That's not the way that the Romans would have done it. The Romans would have encircled Fallujah, they would have encircled Baghdad, they would have starved the population, and then they would have obliterated the place. So what I'm saying is the United States, I think, has in intention and in effect pursued a morally different strategy than that pursued, let's say, by Hussein.
Mr. Dsouza, my name's Noah. I'm a master's student here at the Kennedy School. My question for you is, you've talked about how the rules have changed and the justification for preemptive war. When we went into Iraq with that justification of finding weapons of mass destruction, we didn't find any. And so my question for you is, in the future, do you think that any politician or any public is going to support the doctrine of preemptive war, given how we went into Iraq looking for something that we didn't find?
I think that you have to remember that before the United States went in, there was something of an international consensus, and there certainly was a bipartisan consensus in America that Saddam was a danger, but not just a danger to his own people, but that he was in fact pursuing these weapons. Now, that's why Kerry voted for the resolution in the first place. If the presence of these weapons was such a fiction, you would never have had the support that it garnered, the U.S. action. Now, the point is this. Saddam Hussein's own behavior prior to the American invasion strongly corroborated the suspicion supported by intelligence that he had these weapons. Otherwise, his behavior makes very little sense. You've got a guy, the United States is amassing lethal force to invade his country. He doesn't have any weapons of mass destruction. All he has to say is, time out. Guys, send in your inspectors, take a good look. There are no weapons of mass destruction. Thank you very much. And he would still be ruling Iraq. His own behavior tended to support the belief that, yes, he had the weapons. He was defying the United Nations. He was violating the agreements that he signed after the first Gulf War. So I guess what I'm saying is, if a mistake was made, a colossal mistake, there should be a post-mortem. What happened here? But let me give you one example to show why too much gnashing of teeth is not justified in this area. Let me give you a concrete example. During World War II, actually in the time leading up to World War II, Albert Einstein was notified by a group of emigre scientists from Germany, Jewish scientists, that, look, we believe that the Germans are building an atomic bomb. Their project is headed by Werner Heisenberg, the inventor of the uncertainty principle. The United States needs to counter this. Einstein went to Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt instituted the Manhattan Project. The United States builds the bomb, drops it on Japan a second time, and we discover now, years later, that the Germans were nowhere close to building an atomic bomb. They had a small operation. There's some debate about whether Heisenberg was even trying to torpedo that operation from the inside. But be that as it may, our information that the German bomb was imminent, totally wrong. And yet we build a bomb on false pretenses, and yet no one goes around saying, Einstein lied, FDR lied. They didn't lie. They acted on the best information available at the time. If the information was wrong, as sometimes is the case, you've got to look at why. And you've got to try to rectify the institutions that generated that. So that debate is a legitimate and valid one in America.
My name is Boris Van. I'm a freshman at the college. In Neil Ferguson's recent book, Colossus, he speaks of how we need direct control with long-term occupation and large investment in America's policies of liberation. Do you agree with this? And if so, how can America support this with its huge welfare state and budget deficit at the moment?
Yeah, Neil Ferguson's a good guy, a colleague of mine at the Hoover Institution. He's also an Englishman, and as you know, they had a little different way of doing empire in their days. Somewhat reminded of something Gandhi years ago was asked by someone, what do you think of Western civilization? And he said, I think it would be a good idea. The Europeans did colonialism, and they ultimately, one may say, I'm hesitant to say they failed at it. They failed in the profound sense that they ended up teaching their colonial subjects the language of liberation that ultimately resulted in the colonialists themselves being ejected. But American imperialism, if one may call it that, is of a very different species. Americans don't want to rule Afghanistan or Iraq, and that puts certain limitations on American foreign policy. So while in theory, one might say that one way to do colonialism, and perhaps Ferguson's way is this would be the only way to do it right, is a massive commitment of resources, a 30-year commitment to rebuilding and so on. The answer is America just isn't going to do that. If there is heart to be taken in American empire, it's taken by the knowledge that, look, I won't just talk about Germany, because that's a special case, a Western society where the knowledge to rebuild was already there. But look at Japan. Japan, to me, is very interesting. A society historically very feudal, very hierarchical, a society of samurai swordsmen. This society has, in a relatively short space of time, I mean, it began, I know, with the Meiji Restoration, but more recently, since World War II, look at the incredible cultural transformation of Japan. A society that was once militaristic is now pacific, almost pacifist. A society that was once semi-feudal is now capitalist and commercial. We've taken a nation of costume swordsmen and transformed it in a pretty short time into, one may say, a nation of photographers. That's a big cultural change.
Hi. When you started off your talk, you referred to the Marxists at the Romance Languages Department at Harvard. Could you tell us who some of the Marxists are there? And I want to follow up on the 100,000 deaths question, because United Nations statistics showed during the 1990s, because of the sanctions, the infant mortality rate in Iraq went from 47 per thousand to 108 per thousand, leading to over 500,000 people dead. Madeleine Albright was confronted by Leslie Stahl on 60 Minutes. She said the price is worth it. You just said that we don't intentionally try to kill people, and that's why our killing is okay. Could you say that the children, that was a justifiable policy? When you presented your ideas, you said the terrorists kill 1,000, 100,000, 500,000, possibly 1 million people. Seems to me we're getting into those kinds of figures. Does that disturb you in any way or move you in any way to rethink some of your position?
Your question makes me feel a bit like the mosquito in the nudist colony. I'm not sure where to begin. I perhaps will pass over your invitation to name the romantic Marxists at Harvard for the simple reason that jokes lose something of their power when they're explained. I meant that in a kind of as a friendly jibe, not a substantive point. Now, with regard to the sanctions, it's very interesting that when the Bush administration invaded Iraq, you had lots of people who were strongly opposed to the sanctions suddenly jump to the view that the sanctions were working. In fact, it was one of the main lines of criticism against Bush. Why did you have to invade Iraq? The inspectors were doing their job. The sanctions were working. And the truth of it is the sanctions were not working for the reason that you suggest. So invasion was not simply the sanctions in italics. It was an alternative to sanctions. It was a way of saying, yes, now we have a policy in sanctions, which, by the way, was a UN policy. We have a policy in sanctions that is not hurting Hussein and his cronies and the so-called nomenclatura ruling Iraq. You have a policy of sanctions that's hurting the people it's not intended to hurt. Much better to target the regime. Much better, as Tony Blair said, to be tough not only on terrorism, but on the cause of the problem. In this case, Hussein and his regime. So one may say that the Bush administration policy, I take it this was not the thrust of your question, had the effect of saving countless Iraqi lives, because all the infants who are not being born and being killed in an ongoing, interminable, useless policy of sanctions, that has all been brought to a stop. And now you have the possibility, not only the possibility, the reality of schools opening in Iraq and water flowing and hospitals and American aid and self-government. So I take it that Iraq's promise vindicates what America did and stopped a Clinton policy, I take it you hesitated to mention, that was extracting a terrible toll on the Iraqi people.
I did say Albright. I didn't hesitate to mention Clinton.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. Since you're from India, it seems that you have been influenced by the caste system in India, the Hindu caste system, with upper castes and lower castes, and you feel that the Americans, and you including, of course, should be the upper caste in this world, and everybody else, like myself, are the lower castes. Now, question number one. Question number two, I'll just place these facts before you, and you can comment on them. In 1959, in December 59, President Eisenhower visited Pakistan, and he went in an open car from the airport. There were cheering crowds, people welcomed him. He went to see a cricket match being played between Pakistan and Australia, and he was there for about a couple of days. In 1961, when Lyndon Johnson was vice president, he came to Karachi, again in an open car, welcoming crowds, cheering people. He got stuck in the crowd at one time, and he got off the car, and he went and shook hands with the camel car driver, who invited back to Washington, and Lady Bird Johnson escorted him in Washington. So then again, Johnson visited again and said, my point being that American leaders could go to the heart of the Muslim world and travel freely without any risk at all, go in open cars. Today, 40 years later, they can't step out of their own country. They say they're leaders of the free world. They can't go visit that free world also without body armor and air cover. And even in England, I believe he had to use the back door at 10 Downing Street. So for this change during the 40 years, are you putting the entire blame on the Muslim world?
Well, look, I won't debate the caste system with you. Suffice to say, my family in India, going back generations, I'm part of a small Indian minority that are converts to Christianity. So we're outside the caste system, which, as you know, is within the Hindu religion. And by and large, the converts, by the way, Islamic as well as Christian, generally came from the lower castes. Because in an oppressive caste structure, if you were an untouchable, it was kind of in your interest to get out of the system by becoming a Muslim or becoming a Christian. So I do have to give one cheer, if not two, to the Portuguese colonialists who steered my family outside of the lower rungs of the caste system. Now, with regard to the visiting of the Muslim world and so on, look, 50 years ago, or 30 years ago even, the world was very different. The main thrust of politics in the third world was anti-colonialism generally, and the main Muslim response to it was nationalism. The most important figure in the Arab world was Nasser. He was an Egyptian nationalist. If you went to Nasser and said to him, look, why don't you leave Egypt, go to Afghanistan, live for 10 years in a cave, he would think you were crazy. Why? Because to Nasser, it was ethnicity, it was nationality that mattered. We're now seeing something very different. One of the Islamic theoreticians, one of the founders of the Muslim Brotherhood that I cite in my book, What's So Great About America, says a true Muslim has no nationality except his belief. There's an invisible cord linking the Muslims of the world. Now, this idea has replaced, one may say, Arab nationalism as the central organizing principle of Islamic politics. I'm not saying all Muslims agree with it. There's a clash of civilizations in the Islamic world over it. There's a clash of civilizations in this country over how to respond to it. So I'm not describing as a monolith anyone. I'm just saying this is the dominant trajectory of today's politics. And Islamic parties are winning even in Turkey, even in Malaysia, gaining traction in India. So look, this is a development internal to the Muslim world. Now, does the United States have something to do with it? Yes, I think, in fact, part of my book is examining a very powerful Islamic attack on American policy, on American society, on American morality, trends driven not just by foreign policy, but by globalization, by the information revolution. Bin Laden, in one of his videos, said Islam faces the greatest threat it has faced since Muhammad. Now, if you think about that, how is that possible? Is that because of Israel? No. Is it because of American troops in Mecca? No. It's about something far more profound than that. I won't be able to get into it now, but I will as we go along. I just want to be able to take more questions. But let me just say very briefly that there is a legitimate Islamic critique. We should not, and I don't, dismiss it on intellectual grounds. But neither is it the case that all of this is America's doing. The most important point that I want to emphasize here is that what we are seeing here is something that is, I think, from a historical point of view, profoundly pathological. The critics of America, domestically and foreign, are mobilized and galvanized by this antagonism toward America, whereas their own comments testify to America's evident moral superiority. Here's what I mean. One of the advantages, someone said earlier, I'm an immigrant, and one of the things immigrants do is they compare America to some other existing country, to some other society that either exists or did exist or used to exist. And one of the interesting things about the Michael Moores of this world is that they don't compare America to any other country. They compare America, one may say, to utopia. If someone said, Michael Moore will say, isn't it ironic that we fought the first Gulf War? Ultimately, what drove it was not to liberate Kuwait, it was our self-interest. Now, you mentioned Pakistan, so I'll tell you that recently Pervez Musharraf was interviewed by a journalist who said, you used to support the Taliban. Now you're against them. Why? Musharraf gave a one-line answer. Our national self-interest has changed. Next question. Everywhere in the world, it's taken for granted that every country, bar none, follows its self-interest. But to the critics of America, they are shocked to find out that America actually pursues its self-interest.
Hello, Mr. Dsouza. Sorry. My name is Jesse. I'm a master's student here at the Kennedy School. I wanted to follow up on what you had said earlier about the new sheriff rationale or the John Wayne rationale for the war in Iraq. To what extent do you believe that that line of thinking informed President Bush's decision to go in as opposed to a direct assessment of a threat from Iraq? And if, as you suggest, this is a sort of motivation that politicians are unlikely to admit to, what responsibility does a statesman in a democratic society have to be forthcoming about these sort of motivations?
Let me say two things about that. One is that the reason that I suspect that this could have been a factor is simply because of the statements on the part of the Al-Qaeda leadership that America, although possessing the power to do harm, had lost the will. In other words, the Islamic stereotype, one may say, was the effete American. And bin Laden's evidence was, Hey, we blew up the coal. We blew up Khobar Towers. We've lit quite a few fires under the Americans, and what did they do? They turned and ran. They didn't do anything. We declared war on America. What did they do? Nothing. So bin Laden professed by his own words to have been emboldened by the cowardice of America. Remember when America first told the Taliban, deliver the Al-Qaeda trainees, and you can stay in power. And their reaction was, it wasn't just that they said, after reflective deliberation, we decline. Their reaction was, you chickens, you wimps, come and get us. My point is the rest of the world was contemptuous. During the days of Clinton, this was not, I didn't see this in any White House press releases, but Clinton received during the Lewinsky scandal numerous chastity belts from foreign governments and from NGOs abroad. The basic attitude was, all you're concerned about is your own lechery. Your foreign policy is an extension of your own lechery. So this attitude toward America, great power, it bordered on the derisive. So in this situation, not created by Bush, by the way, but inherited by him, it seems to me very important to say, you're dealing with a different America. By the way, this happened also with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was used to a relatively pliant America. Between 1974 and 1980, 10 countries fell into the Soviet orbit. I think one of the striking things now that we have records from the Soviet Union is that the Soviets were struck by Reagan is first in the firing of the air traffic controllers. They were like, surprised by that. Second, the invasion of Grenada, a very small country, a tiny island. But before Grenada, you had the Brezhnev doctrine. Once a country goes communist, it stays communist. So for even one country to revert back into the camp of free countries was a devastating refutation of the Brezhnev doctrine. So what I'm getting at is that it's important in the world to send a message about the kind of society you are. I think it was very important after 9/11 to send a message that, look, if there was a terrorist action in America, America would not react in the way that Spain reacted. We're not going to pull out of Iraq. Even the liberals aren't going to feel that way. It's important that Al-Qaeda recognizes that. Now, in a democratic society, does the government have the right, the duty to level with us? I guess my answer is partially yes. And I say partially because we don't live in a direct democracy. We live in a representative democracy in which we entrust other people, Clinton, Bush, and so on, to make decisions for us. And this, in foreign policy, even more than in domestic policy, concedes to it goes with the delegation of power that there is an element of withholding or secrecy that is permitted and that is sanctioned democratically itself. So we can debate the individual case, but I think that it is possible that at times the true rationale can be withheld if it is for good reason, ultimately open to democratic scrutiny.
Thank you.
Dinesh, my name's Lenny Glynn. I work in the mutual fund business in Boston. I'm just a citizen. I wanted to ask you a question about the competence of executing this war in Iraq. I'm struck by the fact I was reading a history of World War I yesterday and realized we've been in this Iraq war as long as we were in the First World War. Wilson enters in April of 1917. The war ends in November. The United States, more or less from a standing start, mobilizes 1.5 million troops, ships them across the submarine-infested Atlantic to France, puts 800,000 in the line, fights the war. In Iraq, we've appropriated $87 billion. Apparently, only $3 or $4 billion have found their way out the other end of the pipeline. We knew that once we crossed the border, the key to winning is having support from the Iraqis, who, as you say, must ultimately fight for their freedom. We barely have 100,000 of them mobilized. There's a lot of other errors that one could cite all the way down. Let the looting run so it does more damage than the bombing. Fire the army, thereby staffing an incipient insurgency with trained people. Leaving the arms dumps unguarded because we sent too few troops. Can we talk a little about, assuming that the war is a justified war and the goal is a good goal, how competently has this administration pursued it?
I think that...
and shouldn't there be consequences for someone? I mean, I'm not saying the president obviously got elected, but shouldn't he, as war leader, Lincoln, as war leader, fired some generals. So did Roosevelt, so did Churchill.
Well, I certainly agree that one of the things about democratic foreign policy is that we debate these issues, but particularly when you were dealing not with the principles of the war, not the causes of the war, but the operational strategy of the war. I mean, it's a little difficult for mutual fund investors and think tank guys from the Hoover Institution to decide whether or not Fallujah should be attacked, how many battalions should be deployed. These are tactical questions. They require military expertise in the field. I agree that democratically we can second-guess those, and we can second-guess those judgments. For example, I think no one would deny that Paul Bremer was highly competent to do the job he was asked to do. Now, coming into a country like Iraq, you have a guy like Bremer faced with a very difficult situation. You've got a tyrannical regime in which all the experience belongs to the bad guys. It's a little bit like Russia. You want to privatize public assets. Well, who is experienced in running them? Obviously, all the old communists who were running it before. And so what Russia did was sell off, often at bargain basement prices, valuable state assets, oil companies and so on, to members of the former nomenclatura, and cronyism and corruption has run riot. For this reason, in my view, Paul Bremer said, look, we have to disenfranchise the old Ba'athist regime. Yeah, I realize we've got some trained inspectors of police, but they've been trained in torturing guys. We'd rather get some inexperienced guy in there and give him a chance because symbolically it's very important not to let the old regime in through the back door. This, in my view, was Bremer's intent. Now again, you can say that was a wrong call. You can say that they should have cleaned house. You can say that Bremer should have just made his peace with the Ba'athist guys. But my point is, we can debate these prudential judgments, and we should. Ultimately, I think that we are too hard on ourselves. We should realize that this kind of thing is a big mess. Truthfully, we're not very good as a country in nation building. Truthfully, we don't have that many people who know Urdu and Farsi and Arabic. In fact, we have a lot of people who in the 80s and 70s were learning Russian. That's what they were preparing for. Maybe 10 years from now, we'll have some guys who know Farsi. But again, you mentioned World War I, but you know, in 1946 and 1947, anyone could have walked into Germany and Japan and said, look, this place is a mess. You got old Nazis still shooting at us. You got crazy emperor worshippers still believing this and that. It took 9 years to pacify Japan after the war. So my point is, yeah, I think we're going through the worst. This is the immediate aftermath of the war. The enemies are emboldened. They know the Clausewitzian maxim that war is not just resources, but resources times will. Mm-hmm. And they know that this is the moment to break our will. If they don't do it, if they can't do it, I think 3 years from now we could all be looking at a much more stable, self-governing Iraq and be very glad that we did what we did.
Okay.
We just have time for 2 more questions, so let's take this one and then this one.
My name is Lars Hartenstein. I'm a student at the Kennedy School. There's an argument that the hostility of the Arab world towards America is partly due to the fact that America is readily accusable of a bias in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Is there some merit in this argument, or is it just rhetoric?
Your question, its complexity and difficulty inspires in me the thought that I should have cut off the questions before you got up. But anyway, I think that the Israeli-Palestinian, let me say a couple things. One is, I don't think that that was the prime engine originally motivating the bin Laden guys. No. If you're asking me, is it a festering sore, a major source of Arab animus against America? Yes. I also want to point out something else, and that is that there are many conflicts in the world. 9/11, the Bali bombing, the Madrid bombing, the conflict in Chechnya and Kashmir, the Israeli-Palestine conflict. We tend to lump these all into one category, terrorism. I think that there is an important moral distinction to be made. The 9/11 bombing, the Bali bombing, the Khobar Towers, the Madrid bombing, that's terrorism in the classic sense. what's going on in Kashmir, what's going on in Chechnya, what's going on in the Israeli-Palestine conflict, in my view, that is not terrorism, pure and simple. Those are, one may say, wars of national liberation. We might agree with them, we might not agree with them, but you can't simply dismiss them as terrorism. You have to look at the merits of the original claim. But these conflicts are exploited. For example, Putin says to Bush, hey, listen, you're fighting terrorism, you're trying to exterminate Al-Qaeda, I'm trying to exterminate the Chechens. You want me to help you exterminate Al-Qaeda, you help me exterminate Chechnya. I think this is a moral equation that we should be a little careful about. And again, part of the moral confusion comes from defining the war as a war against terrorism. It's not exactly a war against terrorism, as I said earlier. Now, I want to point out a second thing, which about the Israeli-Palestine conflict, and that is this. From the Muslim point of view, remember that we look at the Muslim world somewhat ethnocentrically through dark glasses. They look at America equally ethnocentrically through equal dark glasses. Now, from the Muslim point of view, the truth is something like this. They say, we keep hearing all these people say that American foreign policy is driven by oil. This is the view of Noam Chomsky, Michael Moore. American foreign policy is driven by oil. And the Muslims say, wait a minute, if American foreign policy is driven by oil, why is America supporting the state of Israel? Israel doesn't have any oil. We have all the oil. And some people say, well, Israel is our only friend in the Middle East. And the Muslim answer is, well, isn't Israel part of the reason why everybody else is your enemy? In other words, if your main goal is oil, self-interest, you should be supporting us, but you're not. You're supporting Israel. What does that prove? That proves that your policy is based on one thing alone: anti-Muslim bigotry. You hate the Muslims. Why else would you be supporting such a one-sided policy? Now, here's what I'm getting at. In America, there are complicated reasons why American policy is, in my view, somewhat one-sidedly in favor of Israel. Part of it is the moral shadow of the Holocaust. Part of it is political. There are complicated reasons why this is the case. But the truth of it is, there is a criticism of American foreign policy in America that comes from the far left. I'm not talking about debates about strategy or the Iraq War. I'm talking about an American corroboration of the worst fear of the Muslims. So the Muslims say, you must hate the Muslims, that's why you do what you do. And here on the American side, a chorus led by Noam Chomsky says, you're right. That's why we do what we do. So Muslim ethnocentrism, Muslim fear is corroborated from within the West by a kind of anti-American left that confirms the worst suspicions of the Muslim world. And this is not to say in a crude way there's an alliance between Noam Chomsky and so on. No, but I'm saying that there is a symbiotic relationship between domestic and foreign understandings of America, and we should not expect, and sometimes those lines of thought reinforce each other, explain each other, converge upon each other.
One last question. Ami Banerjee, School of Public Health. Thank you, Mr. Dsouza, for such an unbalanced account of American foreign policy. As a physician, I recognized the paranoia and over-exaggeration that made terrorism so prominent in the US presidential election when there were many other important issues to be dealt with. I want to bring 2 points to your attention. Firstly,
It's a question.
yeah, it is a question. Firstly, you say that brute force in the face of international law is sometimes necessary for the common good. How do you answer the claim that American exceptionalism to international law actually makes it more vulnerable in the eyes of the rest of the world to terrorism? Secondly, I just want to question whether your idea that US ideals for export around the world are so ideal. At the School of Public Health, among others, it's very common teaching that among developed nations, the gradient of inequality, whether socioeconomic, whether on health grounds, whether on education grounds, is actually the widest in the developed world. Is this the kind of ideal you want to be spreading around the world?
Well, I guess my short answer is yes, for the following reasons. Let me take your 2 points sequentially. the attacks on America, and I'm talking about the real attack. I mean, I'm not talking about 150,000 angry Frenchmen hurling their handbags on the ground after the invasion of Iraq. I'm talking about the attacks on America directly, the people who are willing to pay a price to kill. They're not doing it because the U.S. is flouting international law. They don't care about international law. They don't even care about negotiations. They don't have any demands. Their movement is, one may say, at the outer boundaries of politics. It's not as if bin Laden has 3 things, and if we did them, he would do things differently. You're dealing with a very powerful primal force in politics. And see, this to me is the great liberal illusion. The great liberal illusion is that in the world, if there are bad guys, they are only apparently bad guys. Either society made them bad, or we made them bad. We made them do what they do. And the solution to this is medical treatments, lengthy counseling, interminable negotiations. But I think the example of numerous people through history, starting in the 20th century with people like Hitler, Idi Amin, Saddam Hussein, and so on, is international law and the nostrums of international law and this organization, the United Nations, lacking as it does any instrument of force to actually implement. Look at the UN Charter. You have a right to free speech. You have a right to express your mind. You have a right to assemble. Half the members of the UN ignore all these rights. What does the UN do about it? Nothing. Nothing. Because the United Nations, ultimately, its ideals are ideals to be held up. Everyone has the right to food. Everyone has the right to clothing and so on. And it's true that liberals around the world see this and they go, wonderful, the right to food is being recognized in Cuba. The right to medical treatment is being recognized in Haiti. In Rwanda, human dignity is held up as but where's the enforcement? Now come to the United States, because you did do something that I said that liberals don't do, which is make an actual historical comparison. You said, look, the Europeans, they provide all this. They give you health care. They protect the most vulnerable members of society. And here you get to a very interesting point, which is to say modernity or liberalism, the liberalism that I think we want to introduce to a greater degree in the Muslim world. This liberalism comes in different varieties. And there are certain important liberal values. Security, compassion, merit, opportunity. Now, my point is, Europeans and Americans as a society have opted for a different mix of these liberal values. For example, I would say that Europe has opted for greater security at the expense of merit and opportunity. America has opted for less security, but greater merit and greater opportunity. In America, it is much easier for the ordinary fellow to have a shot at success, even great success, than in most places in Europe. In Europe, and I've traveled widely in it, you meet a rich guy in France, and chances are he's from a rich family. Not that there aren't success stories in Europe, but they are somewhat unusual. In America, they're so commonplace that we've stopped counting. So in America, there's less of an emphasis on having cradle-to-grave protection and more an emphasis on saying, look, in a meritocratic society, give everyone a chance to make a better life for himself. And that's why, by the way, the immigrants flock here. The immigrants flock here in the great numbers they do. And I add a further point to it, that the immigrants in Europe are largely undigestible. Look at the Muslims in France and Germany. They can't really become Frenchmen and Germans, can they? Why not? Because ethnic identity in the European countries is mainly a function of birth. Just as if you come to India, even if you were to live for 40 years, you can't become Indian, because being an Indian requires brown skin and Indian parents. But in America, you have the Irish and the Italians and the Jews, and today the West Indians and the Koreans, and all of us over time, and sometimes it takes 2 generations, become American, because America has a principle of assimilation. It is our ethnic identity is based less on birth or blood, and more on, one may say, fidelity to a certain set of ideas and a way of life, the American way of life. So America has nothing to fear or apologize for in comparing itself to Europe. The American founders came here against Europe. They were within Western civilization, but against the stratified, one may say hierarchical societies of Europe, where I agree, there is noblesse oblige in Europe, but noblesse oblige means I will help you because I am better than you. Noblesse oblige arises out of a principle of contempt. Europeans invented the principle of religious toleration, but religious toleration contains within it the seeds of contempt. If I tolerate you, I mean I can't stand you. I'll put up with you even though you suck. That's toleration. Americans went one better and invented the principle of religious freedom. Religious freedom is not tolerance. Religious freedom means everyone has the right to practice their own faith, and that right is held equally whether you're Protestant or Catholic or Jewish or Muslim or not at all. So America has different ideals than Europeans, and America's in a different position in the world than Europe is today. 100 years ago, when Europe had the power, it was perfectly happy to project it. It made a mess of it, but it was happy to try. Now America has the power. Now years ago, as I said, Jefferson said we're an empire of liberty. But at the time, the newly formed American government had ideals, universal ideals, by the way. The Declaration of Independence doesn't say all Americans are created equal. It says all men. And what is Iraq except a test of this American proposition? One may say that looking at the experience of the Arab world, history says no, but America says yes. And we're testing it out. We'll see who's right. But there is a universalism built into American exceptionalism, and America's in a unique moment in which it has, for the first time, not just the universal ideals, but it does have power. Now, I agree with Shakespeare in Measure for Measure. It's wonderful to have a giant's strength, but one should, but it is tyrannical to use it like a giant. We should be careful about how American power is used. So to that degree, the European criticisms and concerns should be heeded. But I think having heeded them and taken them into account, we should then proceed to, one may say, ignore them, recognizing that the Europeans are in a very different situation and that despite all these cautions and caveats, valid though they may be, we are still in a position to protect ourselves and do some good in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Dsouza. Ladies and gentlemen, he will be going up to the Harvard Coop where he'll be signing his book, What's So Great About America. Thank you very much.